This is our second video dealing with political geography, and again what I would like all of you to be reading is Chapter 8. These are the learning objectives for this video. There are 3. We're going to be kind of all over the map here. We're going to start out with a final introductory concept, and that final term is the idea of supranationalism. Then we're going to move on to what political geographers have identified as the 5 basic state shapes. We will then talk about which of those 5 is the ideal, which one is the best, and why. Finally, we will describe the difference between what political geographers call a unitary state and what they call a federal state. So let's start out with this idea of supranationalism. Supranationalism is basically expressed in something called the supranational institution, which is an organization that brings together 2 or more states. And the way that I want to start talking about a supranational institution is by describing what the word supra means. Supra means above. Above, basically the opposite of sub, which means below. So remember sub-state nationalism, that means it's operating within the state. Supra, which means above, means that it's operating basically above the state, like an umbrella institution that brings together 2 or possibly 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or anything more than 2 states. Now the way that I've done it here is I've divided supranational institutions into 2 categories. There are those that are basically political and military with respect to their institutional framework, and they're basically about cooperation. So here's one example, the United Nations. The United Nations brings together all of the world's states into one single place where they can debate and discuss and set policy. It's headquartered in New York, but it's basically a global, supranational, political institution. Here's one that's a little bit more military in its orientation, NATO, which stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, bringing together the United States and Western Europe and Turkey into a single military alliance. So the reason they are supranational is because these alliances or institutions bring together states in a way into like basically an umbrella category that crosses state borders. Here's another example, but it's primarily economic. Later on in our discussion of political geography, we'll have a case study where we look at the European Union, or the EU. The EU is probably one of the best examples of a supranational entity that you'll find in the world today, because it brings together about 25 of the European states into something that kind of looks like a single state, basically one of the most powerful and best examples of a supranational institution that you will find in the world today. And one final thing, supranational entities, supranational institutions are becoming more popular. 200 years ago we really didn't have any, but today we have multiple. And so there are many people in the world, especially political geographers who study this stuff, who are making the case, making the argument that supranational entities and institutions are kind of the wave of the future, that we'll have more of them and they will become more important in terms of shaping political life as we go deeper into the 21st century. Just to give you one final example, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, is also an example of a supranational entity. And it's one that, of course, plays a pretty prominent role in shaping economic life here in the United States. Because what it did is it created a single marketplace between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Something we didn't have 20 years ago, but we have today. Now, let's change our gears pretty abruptly and talk about what political geographers think is important with regard to the shapes of states. Another way of talking about this is state morphologies. The word morphology is basically a fancy word for the term shape. So if you're looking at a state on the map, you can look at its shape. You can see what it's basically looks like geographically. And although the technical term is morphology, it might be easier for us to just talk about it using everyday language like the word shape. Political geographers have identified exactly 5 different types of shapes that states usually fall into. One is compact, another is elongated, the third is fragmented, the fourth is prorupted, and the fifth is perforated. I realize that the maps that I have down here are pretty hard to read, but let me explain what they do. They give us an example of each one of these 5. So compact is this state right here. It's basically circular in shape. It is Cambodia. Cambodia is a good example of a compact morphology or a compact shape. Elongated is found here in Chile, or Chile as a lot of Americans call it. It's elongated because it's about 20 times as long as it is wide. So other states that have a elongated shape might be, for example, Norway, Sweden, and Italy. Fragmented is this state here. It's Indonesia. It's basically a collection of islands that are all separate from one another. So it's quite literally fragmented into multiple pieces. Other examples of fragmented states would actually include the United States of America, because both Alaska and Hawaii are separated from the mainland United States quite literally over thousands of miles. Prorupted states is like this one here, Thailand. It's basically compact, but then you've got this long skinny tail. And that long skinny tail, if you want to call it that, is what geographers call the prorupt. And so the overall morphology or shape of Thailand is prorupted. And then finally perforated. There's really only one really good example of a perforated state, and that is here, South Africa. And that is because it has quite literally a hole right in the middle of it. And that is the state of Lesotho. Lesotho is completely surrounded by South Africa. Now the question then becomes, which one of these 5 is considered by political geographers to be the best? Which one is considered to be the ideal situation? Well, it's the compact morphology. Basically what we have here with regard to Cambodia. And why that is for at least 2 main reasons. One is because the border is going to be shorter given a certain amount of area. So in the case of, let's say, Cambodia, you've got a geographic area, and the border is going to be shortest if you have a compact morphology. Now you might be thinking, why should that matter? Well, it has to do with military strategy. It's easier to defend a short border than a long one. And just compare Cambodia with Chile. Imagine that they both have about the same geographic area, but because of Chile's elongated morphology, what that means is it has a really long border, and it's much harder then to defend Chile. Its military has to spend more money and has to work a little harder. There's another reason, and it's probably even more important. When you have the compact morphology, what it means is there are fewer regions or areas within that state that are likely going to be very distant from the core culture, from the capital city. So let's just give the example of Indonesia. The main island of Indonesia is over here. That's where most Indonesians live. That's where the capital city is. That's where the big cities are. But if you live way over here, quite literally thousands of miles away, you probably never travel to the capital city and you feel alienated from the core culture. That can create problems with sub-state nationalism because these people likely don't speak the same language, and they probably feel like their voice isn't well represented. And that's also true here in the prorupt of Thailand, down here in the southern tip. You're really far from Bangkok. You're really far from the core culture. So in the compact shape, you kind of mitigate both of these problems. And thus, political geographers have made the argument quite convincingly that the compact morphology is almost always the best. Now, let's wrap up this video by looking at one additional set of terms, and that is the idea of a unitary versus a federal state. Basically, the difference between these two can be summarized really simply. A unitary state is characterized by a high degree of centralized power, whereas a federal state is characterized by a relatively low degree of centralized power, meaning power is more decentralized. A good example of a unitary state is France. And what that means is in France, power, in other words, political decision-making authority, is highly centralized in one point. And that one point is the capital city of Paris. Another way of looking at this is through an example. Let's say the people who live way over here in Alsace, what if they wanted to maybe experiment and try out the death penalty for murder, let's say. Well, they probably wouldn't be able to do so because policy is set way over here in Paris. And Paris has a blanket policy that they don't embrace the death penalty. So even if the Alsatians wanted to experiment with using the death penalty, they couldn't, because France's architecture is basically organized around this unitary idea of how you organize state power. In contrast, the United States of America is not a unitary state, but rather a federal state. And what that means is power is relatively decentralized. And I suppose the best way of giving you that example or illustrating this is through an example. And here we have a map of the United States where, color-coded in red, are states that have the death penalty, and in yellow are those states that basically prohibit it. So it's not decided in Washington, D.C. They don't make a blanket policy for the entire country, but that decision is made in each one of the individual state capitals. Minnesota and Wisconsin have decided we don't like the death penalty, and so we're not going to have it. Whereas Texas and Louisiana have decided, yeah, we do like it, so we're going to use it. That kind of decentralized political decision-making capability would not exist in a unitary state, but it does exist in a federal state. I'll give you just one additional example. Each state has their own laws with regard to, let's say, gay marriage. Gay marriage is legal in New York and Massachusetts, but it's illegal in Kentucky and Wisconsin and Utah. The same thing is true with regard to taxes. Some states have income taxes, other states do not. Policy is not set in Washington. Rather, it's set in a decentralized kind of way at each one of the state capitals. Okay, see all of you in the third video.